Hi, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I built an older Vollmer two-stall engine house and tried to make it a little more Americanized. There's a friend of mine who's a member of the McKeesport Model Railroad Club. They are the home of the Montauk Valley Railroad. Now this terrific HO scale club and layout is located in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. And they've got a wonderful railroad there and a great group of members. And they do all the things that model railroad clubs hope to be able to do, such as running the trains, holding open houses, having families come in, especially around the holidays. And they also do community outreach in their clubhouse. Now, one of the things they also have is a trolley line on their layout. So my friend had asked me if I could build this engine house into a trolley shed and make it look a little more Americanized. So I'll show you what I did. This is an older kit, and these are all the walls that come inside. They're rather old castings. And this shows you everything else that comes in the kit. There's a lot there. The first thing I started doing was removing all of the walls from the sprues and cleaning them up. But I noticed that a couple of the walls, along with some other pieces, were warped, probably because the kit was so old and it had been sitting for quite a while. So I took all of the flat walls and I went ahead and airbrushed them with a Vallejo rust color. And this shows the difference between the painted walls and the unpainted wall. Now, I had painted all of the pieces that were flat, but I started working on the two warped walls. First thing I was going to try was putting weights on them and using my hair dryer. So I heated them up as much as I could and let the weights sit there until they cooled down, but that really did nothing. So I brought out the big guns. I went to my wife's stove and I put them in there at 170 degrees for 1 hour with the weights on top, and they came out perfectly flat. So I went ahead and painted those walls. Then I had to glue back on the roof support pins that I had removed in order to flatten them. Now, one of my favorite ways of putting mortar in brick walls is using a distress crayon. But with all the protrusions and angles on these brick walls, it wasn't going to work very well. So I used a method that Brett Wiley has shown online. And this is using artist pigments, brushing them on the walls, and then going over the walls with a wet sponge. I tried the sponge at first, but again the protrusions made that not work so well. So I used a wet brush. And again, here I'll show you how it works. You brush on the pigments dry, and you can use any type. AK and MIG make some. I get mine from Gamblin. And then you wet it down. And it looks at first like you've taken everything off, but you can see that the pigment has stayed within the crevices of the brick. And then once it dries, you get a pretty effective mortar look, with the bonus being that it looks uneven. So I continued this method, putting the mortar on all of the brick walls that I had. Next up was painting the windows and doors. First I took them outside in order to put a spray coating of primer on them. I like using a Tamiya primer, it's nice and thin. Then I put them in my airbrush booth and used some Vallejo intermediate green to paint them similar to the color that they originally were. I started gluing the brick walls together using these bridge pieces, as I call them, that they supplied to put two pieces of walls together. Now, they weren't really strong, so I also put some strip styrene on the inside where the walls joined, just to make a stronger joint. I started rusting the metal window frames using one of my favorites, Mission Models Rust Wash, and I just used a sponge to apply it. And this shows how they come out afterwards. Then once they were dry, I started gluing them in place inside the walls. And this shows you what they look like from the outside. I started gluing two of the back walls together, and they came with one of those bridge pieces, and it was supposed to have pins that went into holes in the walls, but there were no pins on it, but I ended up making it work. Next I turned my attention to the foundation, and this was two separate pieces because they also make a single stall engine house, but they supply some plastic pieces that allows you to glue them together. Now for the main doors, I wanted to rust the metal frames, but the doors were wooden, so I just masked around the window frames. Then I clamped the two front pieces together, again using one of those bridge pieces. And one of these had the roof support pin broken off, so I had to make one and glue it in place. Now the front doors themselves have little skirts you can glue on the bottom, but they're not very strong, so I used some very thin strip styrene to help bridge over the glue joint and make it stronger. You have to bend the door to get it in on the hinges, so I did this before I put the window glass in place. And then once I had the doors in place, I went ahead and used a little bit of oils to weather them. Now I started gluing some of the outside pieces of the windows onto the outbuildings. Then I glued the window frames from the inside in place. And I now had all my windows and doors in place. But the plastic that they had supplied as glass was kind of thick and didn't look very good, so I just used some 5,000 acetate and I glued that inside the windows. Now I could start gluing my walls together. Some of these had strange corners where you had to glue the corner together and then put a couple pieces on the outside, but they weren't very strong. So I again used some strip styrene on the inside of the corners to help make for a stronger joint. Once I got the side walls and the back walls glued together, then I could glue in place the roof supports that go across from the side walls, and that made it a lot more stable, and I was able to glue on the front walls. Then once all those walls were glued in place, I could glue the foundation on. I first did it on one side and then glued it on to the other side. It wasn't exactly a perfect fit. But once I had all that done, I was able to glue on the foundation for the outbuildings. Then I could start erecting the walls on them, and they went together pretty well. Just gluing everything to the previous wall and to the foundation base. Then when it came to the smaller walls, I had to do a little bit of filing and fitting. Now one thing that to me really contributed to the European look was the scalloped shingles that were on the roofs of the outbuildings. So I decided I wanted to change that. I just painted them a dark brown and then covered them with some tar paper stripping that I had. I think this was left over from a rail scale models kit. I started gluing together the chimney that came with the kit, and after I had glued the roofs in place on the outbuildings, I glued the chimney in place, put a couple wire supports going to it, and then put some gallery glass around the base of it to look like tar. Now after painting the skylights for the main roof black, I again used some of my rusting wash on them, and this is how they came out. I put a different rust on the hinges, and then I started gluing the frosted glass that was for them in place. Some of this was warped as well, so I used weights to hold it in place while the glue was drying. Now the main roof had been weathered at the factory, so the skylights looked pretty good in it. It also came with these clips that went around pins on the inside of the walls that you had to glue in place. And I guess it's so you can remove the roof if you need to get inside the building once it's down on your base. One of the things I asked my friend was if we wanted to leave this trim on the roof because it looks kind of European, but we agreed it would look even funnier with that channel and nothing in it, and there was no easy way to remove it, so we decided to leave it in place. Now I started painting some of the detail parts that came with it, and I was going to use the ones that didn't have a European look to them. It also came with some gutters and downspouts, and I taped over where they were going to glue to the underside of the roof, and then spray painted them with a gray. But as it turns out, many of them were warped as well, as you can see here. So I tried this method of straightening them out, just using some weights and bending them in the opposite direction, and then using my little torch to heat it up some and then let it cool. And that worked fine for the shorter gutters. And I used these floral clips to hold it in place while I was gluing it. I went ahead and attached the gutters to the outbuildings, and then I drilled out the ends of the downspouts. Then I used some liquid PSA to glue them in place. I like using this because the glue won't squeeze out when you attach them. Once I had the downspouts glued in place, I started using some of my rust wash to weather them, and I also used some slime for the inside of them where some algae might build up. Now, I wasn't able to glue the gutters onto the main roof for a couple of reasons. They were just a little too warped, and if you're going to remove that main roof, they'd get damaged anyway. So I glued some of the other details onto the building. This is a message board, and here we have an insulator block and a fire alarm. Now, the lamps that came with the kit were definitely European looking, so I just used some tissue fixtures. Once I glued them together, I painted them a gray and painted the inside of the reflector in ivory, and then rusted them a little bit. Then I glued them in place over the main doors and over the doors in the outbuildings. Then I got ready to do all the weathering on the building. And again, using artist pigments, it makes it real easy, and I was able to blend a lot of the brickwork together where the mortar was a little too strong. And this shows on the left where it's been weathered and on the right where it hasn't been. So now the building's all done, and I think it'll work well for a trolley barn set in town outside of Pittsburgh. You're not able to get away with all of the European look to it, but most of it has the same kind of industrial look that you'd find in a brick structure around a rail yard, no matter where you are in the world. And it wasn't exactly a fun kit to put together, I think because it was rather old, so some of the plastic had warped, and some of it just didn't quite fit together right. But it managed to come out pretty okay in the end. And I think it'll look good on the McKeesport layout. And I hope that everyone who visits the layout and gets to see it thinks that it belongs right in place there. Thank you for watching.